Good afternoon, and welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists webinar series. My name is Louis Mantini, and I'm pleased to be today's moderator. I've been a member of the webinar committee for 5 years and currently work as an environmental scientist for the Swanee River Water Management District in Live Oak, Florida. Today's lecture and topic will be Ecology and Response of Sphagnum-dominated Peatlands in Western Washington to Landscape Stressors. And I guarantee, after today, that peatland in your neighborhood will never look the same. Our speaker is Joe Rocchio, who is a program manager for the Washington Department of Natural Resources Natural Heritage Program. The program connects conservation science with conservation actions by collecting, maintaining, and distributing data on rare species and ecosystems, as well as providing several other services and products in support of conservation in Washington State. Joe served as the program's vegetation ecologist from 2007 to 2019, focusing on ecosystem classification, developing ecological integrity assessment tools, and identifying ecosystem conservation priorities. Joe developed a peatland classification for the state and has been leading inventory and research efforts to identify Washington's exemplary peatland sites. Previously, Joe spent 9 years as a wetland ecologist with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, where he conducted inventories for rare and high-quality wetlands. He earned his bachelor's degree in environmental science from Indiana University and his master's in ecosystem analysis from the University of Washington. And with that, I'll turn this presentation over to you, Joe.
Thank you very much. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. And I've got a little window here I got to close, reminding me that I'm supposed to talk right now. All right. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the Society of Wetland Scientists for inviting me here today to share the work that we did on our peatlands in the lowlands of Western Washington. Also, thank you for everyone who for your interest and for the time you are spending today to hear the work that we did. I'm always excited when I get to talk about peatlands. They are hands down my favorite ecosystem. In my role in the Natural Heritage Program, I work with all of Washington's ecosystems, but peatlands are near and dear to my heart. So I'm very, very excited to be able to share the work that we did with you all today. And specifically, I'm going to focus on sphagnum-dominated peatlands in the lowlands of Western Washington. Locally, these peatlands are referred to as bogs. And these bogs reach their southern extent in Western North America in Washington State. As such, they're unique aspects of our natural heritage. There are sphagnum-dominated peatlands in the montane regions of Washington, as well as many other places in the Western US, but those are all clearly acidic fens. And so I'll talk a bit about how these peatlands are different. The bogs I'll be talking about today are primarily found in the most populated portion of Washington State. As such, they have and continue to be exposed to human stressors. And despite widespread recognition and concerns of these impacts, there hasn't been very much research on how these land uses could impact bogs. Really, a lot of the work is just extrapolated research that's been done on how these stressors affect aquatic ecosystems and kind of extrapolated that to these peatland ecosystems. So we wanted to focus on improving our understanding of how these stressors affect these bogs, as well as offer some guidance on how to improve management and protection actions. All right. A little bit of delay on my first slide, par for the course. First off, I'd like to thank U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Region 10 for their financial support in supporting this research. I want to recognize my co-authors on this work, Tiny Mariam Granberg with Washington DNR Natural Heritage, Jeremy Shaw and David Cooper with Colorado State University, and Aaron Herring with the University of Oregon. Also Beck Brasted, who was a project employee we had in the Natural Heritage Program to help collect data, And then a colleague of mine in the Natural Heritage Network, Joshua Cohen, who is the lead ecologist with the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, he came out and spent a week with us and helped us collect data and shared his notes. So we compared notes between Washington and Michigan peatlands. It was a lot of fun. And then also, numerous landowners gave us permission to get out to their sites. Obviously, without their cooperation, we just couldn't have conducted this work. So we really appreciate their interest in what we were doing. So just a basic outline of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to give you just a bit background on Washington State and our peatlands, then describe our research goals, and then focus on our results and conclude again with some recommendations to improve protection and management again of these bogs. So Washington State, for those who, let me get my laser pointer out here, is in the extreme northwest corner of the United States. And the topography of the state, as you can see in this part of the slide, is quite varied. We have the Olympic Mountains, Willapa Hills, the Cascade Range, the Okanagan Highlands, Canadian Rockies, and the Blue Mountains in the southeast corner of the state. Those are all montane regions that add a lot of diversity to the state, also affect our climate and precipitation patterns. Elevations range from sea level all the way up to over 14,000 feet or nearly 4,400 meters at Mount Rainier. So pretty strong kind of wide gradients. In Western Washington, which is generally considered west of the Cascade Crest, so primarily in this area here, you can see that the majority of that area is low elevations outside of the Olympic Mountains and Willapa Hills. And those lowlands on average are less than 2,000 feet or about less than 600 meters. And I point that out because that's the location of our research. So past glaciation has had a significant impact on the state's topography. As you can see in this slide, this aqua blue-green color here was the extent of continental ice, and you can see it covered the northern third of the state. And then a big lobe that came down into what we call the Puget Trough or the Puget Sound region. Also, there was a lot of alpine glaciers that came out of the mountains and left glacial features in many areas. Those two, both continental and alpine ice, have a big impact on where our peatlands occur in the state. Another very interesting glacial feature that isn't really related to peatlands is this orange area here, which are glacial flood channels. There were a series of glacial lakes that were dammed up by the ice. And these were massive lakes, and these ice dams would periodically break, and these massive floods just scoured eastern Washington. It's an incredible landscape, but really no peatlands to speak of in that landscape. So this map shows the degree of continentality, which is the degree to which a region is affected by continental versus maritime climates. And it's really does a nice job of kind of summarizing temperature and precip factors. And it's kind of looking at the extremes, the difference between, for example, January and July mean temps. Yellow colors indicate a high degree of continental climates, blue indicating a strong maritime influence. And you can see here again in Western Washington, the climate is very strongly maritime. The Pacific Ocean keeps temperatures relatively mild year round. Whereas you can see over in Eastern Washington, it's much more of a continental climate. Summer highs are much warmer than Western Washington, and the winters are colder as well. Precipitation is highly variable. The wettest spot in the lower 48 of the United States, so the coterminous part of the United States, occurs in the Olympic Mountains, and there's over 200 inches of rain per year, or about 500 centimeters per year. And then over in Eastern Washington, there's an area that gets only about 6 inches of rain, or about 15 centimeters per year. So again, statewide, a very wide range of precipitation. The state's mountains also have a strong effect on precipitation patterns, with very strong rain shadows northeast of the Olympic Mountains. The general winter pattern of storms is from the southwest moving northeast. And so there's a strong rain shadow here. And then, of course, there's a rain shadow that the Cascades inflict on eastern Washington. Precipitation in Western Washington is primarily rain. And I was just joking with the moderators, we rarely, sometimes we'll get snow, sometimes we won't. This year we haven't had snow until last night. We got 3 wet inches, and It's highly variable, and relative to the peatlands, snowpack is a pretty insignificant driver. We just get a lot of winter precipitation as rain. But also importantly, our precipitation patterns are strongly seasonal. And you can see in these three different graphs from different parts of the state, we have a very wet winter season. And I think most people, that's what we're known for, right, is a very wet, rainy, cloudy area. And that's very true of Western Washington in the winter, but our summers are very dry. We essentially have a wet, dry climate. And that's important in terms of how our bogs function as well. But Washington's glacial history, the topography, the climate have produced ecological templates that allow for peatland development. And just thinking about vegetation characteristics, we have both bogs and fens that occur in the state. However, many peatland ecologists consider bogs to be strictly ombrotrophic, that is rain-fed, while also being dominated by ericaceous shrubs, peat mosses, of course, sphagnum species, and then being very acidic. Fens are minotrophic, which means they're supported by groundwater or surface water that's been in contact with bedrock or soils. And that means that the chemistry of fens can range from being very acidic to also be very alkaline, very contingent on the bedrock and the soils. Also, fens, at least our fens, have an abundance of sedges and deciduous shrubs, and they can not have any mosses or be sphagnum-dominated or brown moss dominated, again, kind of depending on the chemistry. This distinction between ombrotrophic versus minotrophic isn't always how these peatlands are distinguished. Definitely the case here in Washington, but even elsewhere. Typically, or often, vegetation is the only consideration used to classify them. But understanding whether a site functions as an ombrotrophic site, rain-fed site, versus minotrophic is critical for developing appropriate regulatory management and protection strategies. Each hydrological setting results in a different hydrological regime and water chemistry. And so knowing how the site functions, whether it's rain-fed or groundwater supported, allows us to understand how water is moving into and out of the site, as well as enabling us to establish the site's reference water chemistry, if you will. And those are very important to provide a baseline to assess whether or not we see impacts from stressors. So because of that, we feel it's important to consider these hydrological differences and not simply rely on vegetation. In Washington, the term bog, however, is used to describe many different peatlands. Some workers call any peatland dominated by sphagnum a bog. Others are more restrictive and only use the term to describe acidic peatlands dominated by ericaceous shrubs and sphagnum. So it's a little bit more constrained. But because many of those bog species can also occur in acidic fens, they aren't reliable indicators of the site being ombrotrophic, right? And so if we really want to understand that, we need to look at abiotic measures such as water table levels, water table movement, water chemistry, to really confidently know whether or not we have an ombrotrophic site. And in Washington, we only have one published study that's confirmed the presence of an ombrotrophic bog. We published this a few years ago for a raised bog out on the Western Olympic Peninsula. But outside that site, we suspect, but we don't know whether any of our other bogs are truly ombrotrophic. Here are a few photos of some of the sites that meet that vegetation definition of a bog. Predominantly being dominated by those ericaceous shrubs, sphagnum, scattered conifers, lichens, and if you can see in these photos, very little herbaceous species, as well as deciduous shrubs. There are a few present, but they are not the predominant species in these sites. In contrast, here are a few examples of our fens that occur across the state. All of them are graminoid dominated, as well as having some shrubs like Betula glandulosa and various salix species. And they have a hydrology that keeps the peat saturated through most of the year. I didn't mention the previous slide, but our bogs, because of that seasonal pattern, they dry out in the summer. I mean, some of the water tables will go down to 40, in some cases 60 centimeters deep in these bogs because they are tied to precip. Our acidic fens, as I mentioned earlier, are also sphagnum dominated, but they differ, again, by being dominated by sedges as well as deciduous shrubs. So why do we care about these ecosystems? I'm probably preaching to the choir here on this one, but in Washington, these lowland sphagnum-dominated peatlands, or bogs, are considered to be a state-threatened ecosystem type due to the significant loss they've experienced over the past since European settlement, essentially due to land use conversion, as well as ongoing degradation of their ecological integrity. There's at least 17 state-sensitive, threatened, or endangered plant communities that occur in these systems. 13% of the state's rare plants are tied to these bogs. There are 18 beetles that are restricted to these peatlands, 2 rare butterflies, and I just learned this recently. There are 34 spiders that are restricted or primarily found in these peatlands, including the globally imperiled Georgia Basin bog spider. Also, during the course of this research, we collected some peat cores from a few of these sites. I'm not going to talk about that work yet. We haven't really done much with those data, but in the process of doing that, we opened up a hummock and we saw hundreds of tiny little worms, and none of us had ever seen this before. We had some DNA analysis done on it, and it was the first North American record of a little potworm called Cognetia sphagnatorum. It's a species that's apparently pretty common in bogs and conifer forests in Eurasia. And this was the first North American record of this species, which was pretty cool. I'm sure it's elsewhere, but no one has just documented it, which was a lot of fun. Also in Washington, the flora in these sites is not found in any other habitat. So it's from a conservation perspective, important that way. Globally, of course, peatlands play a vital role in carbon sequestration, containing twice as much carbon as in forests. And then, although our resource here in Washington, peatland resource in Washington, is just a small portion of that, from a statewide perspective, it could be a significant piece of our climate mitigation efforts, protecting these sites. So stressors affecting these bogs have changed over time in the past 50 to 75 years. Looking at this chart on the left, you can see that development has increased dramatically around Puget, lowland peatlands, while stressors associated with like mining and pastures and agriculture have declined, primarily as a result of regulations and awareness of what that does to these sites. But of course, stressors can decrease or increase water flows, sediment, nutrients, metals, et cetera. And there have been numerous studies outside of Washington that have demonstrated that those can obviously degrade peatland biodiversity and the ecological processes in these stressors. And then there's, of course, climate change, and peatland response to climate change is very complex, but we would expect potentially shifts in the hydrology, decomposition rates, species interactions, et cetera. And this is especially concerning for our bogs because they're already at I mentioned earlier, they're the southernmost in Western North America. They're already kind of at their climatic extent, if you will. So they're likely going to be very sensitive to climate change. And we're seeing some things that suggest maybe we're already seeing some impacts. But our research was intended to address significant data gaps related to how these systems respond to stressors, as well as update existing and provide new guidance, again, to improve the effectiveness of regulatory conservation and management actions. We sought to address 2 primary questions. One, do ombrotrophic bogs exist in Western Washington? As I mentioned earlier, this question is critical to being able to address the second question, which is, does adjacent land use impact these systems? So to do that, we quantified variation in hydrology, water chemistry, and vegetation across gradients of land use, intensity, precipitation, watershed size, and connectivity. The study area is, again, in Western Washington in an ecoregion called the Puget Lowland ecoregion, which is outlined here in blue. As I mentioned earlier, this area includes the most populated part of Washington state. We typically refer to it as the I-5 corridor because Interstate 5 runs from the Canadian border through Seattle, Tacoma, all the way down to Portland. And so there's a lot of development that's occurred in this ecoregion. The ecoregion lies in a topographic trough between the Cascade Mountains to the east and the Olympic Mountains and Willamette Hills to the west. Most of the ecoregion is actually below 500 feet or a few higher areas, so about 150 meters in elevation. And as I showed earlier, the contemporary landscapes, at least in the northern part of the ecoregion, or the northern half, I should say, was significantly affected by past glaciation. And that continental ice receded about 12,000 years ago. The ecoregion is characterized by mild maritime climate, and as I mentioned earlier, It's a wet-dry cycle. The majority of precipitation greater than 70% falls between October and March. And July through September are very dry. And also within the ecoregion, precipitation is quite variable as well. In that Olympic rain shadow I mentioned earlier, area gets about 17 inches of rain per year, about 45 centimeters. And then the wettest part of the ecoregion is in an area we call in Mason County right here, that gets about 100 inches of rain per year, about 250 centimeters. So a lot of variation in an area I think most people think is pretty homogeneous, wet and green and gray, but there's a lot of variation because of our topography. So because of the uncertainty of whether our bogs are truly ombrotrophic, many workers in Washington have decided to use the term sphagnum-dominated peatlands instead. But in our study area, most of these sphagnum-dominated peatlands appear to be, at least vegetatively, bogs in terms of they're dominated by the bog plant species. But again, we do have other sphagnum-dominated peatlands in the state that are clearly fens, primarily in the montane regions, but even in the Puget lowland ecoregion and elsewhere. So because of that, we intentionally targeted sites that we thought would be ombrotrophic based on those vegetation characteristics. So we targeted, again, those sites dominated by those ericaceous shrubs, sphagnum. We excluded sites that were where the vegetation was suggestive of being ombrotrophic, in other words, being dominated by the sedges, monotrophic or deciduous shrubs, etc. We excluded the fens from our design. So these peatlands are typically found in depressions, and in such settings, they usually form two distinct zones. There's the peatland center in this red polygon area here, and then there's the lag, which is the outer perimeter of the bog. The peatland center is where the typical bog vegetation occurs. That's the place most people would say, I'm in a bog. But actually the lag is an important functional component of the bog ecosystem. It's a kind of a mixing zone. It receives water from the peatland center as well as adjacent uplands or wetlands. And so its water chemistry, its hydrology, and consequently its vegetation is very distinct from the peatland center. And because of that, we actually incorporate both of these ecological zones into our study design. Also, even though I've been talking about these sites being ombrotrophic, many of them have surface water inlets into the basins, but some of them, or most of them, are seasonal, but some of them are permanent. But what happens is that typically these, a stream might enter the system. That water generally stays in the lag and might move around the peatland center and exit on the other end of the basin. So again, there's kind of two distinct hydrological areas in these ecosystems. So based on existing data sources and aerial photo interpretation, we have mapped nearly 600 of these sites in the lowlands of Western Washington, as seen by these magenta purple dots on the map. Within the Puget lowlands, there's just over 400 of them. And almost all of them occur, if you can see this blue line that kind of wraps around here, that is the extent of continental ice. And you can see almost all of them are behind where the ice limit was. So from these sites, of course, I'm simplifying, going from 600 to the 17 sites we selected, but we selected sites to represent a range of variation in watershed size, the amount of impervious surface area within the contributing watersheds as well. And watershed size was used as a proxy for potential surface inflows into the peatland. The assumption being the greater the catchment, presumably the greater the risk of land use activities impacting the peatland, because more water is just being conveyed to the site. We delineated the local surface watersheds specific to each basin, bog basin, as you can see here in these purple lines here, and we did that using a LiDAR-derived flow accumulation model. And then within those watersheds, we use the National Land Cover data set to quantify impervious surface area. And then within the first 50 meters from a bog, we looked at the amount of impervious surface area. And if there was none, that site would be considered reference. We had 5 of those. If there was more than 0, it was a developed site in that first 50 meters. And so developed sites range from 1 to 38% impervious surface area. Within each study site, sample locations were, again, established in each of those 2 zones. So we had well nests, which consisted of a shallow groundwater well, as well as a series of nested piezometers at various depths that help us understand vertical hydrological movement. And we had a well nest, again, in the peatland center and the lag. Some sites we had more than one lag well. We determined topography of both zones using, or the peatland center really, of using LiDAR. Water samples were collected from those shallow wells to measure pore water chemistry during spring and summer, and then we measured pH and electric conductivity in the field from the shallow wells. We purged the wells, let them refill. We collected 250 milliliter samples of filtered, sent off to the University of Washington to analyze for major ions. And then vegetation data was collected using a releve plot method, 100 square meters for herbaceous and shrub types and 400 square meters for forested plots. We also did some more specific transects for looking at tree density, stem density, et cetera. Vascular plant species and non-vascular physiognomic groups were documented in each of the plots, and we recorded ocular estimates of abundance. The non-vasculars, as I mentioned, we used physiognomic groups. We had a sphagnum group, feather mosses, other moss, and lichen. So one kind of shortcoming of our work is that we weren't able to kind of tease out all the different moss species, especially the sphagnum, because the sphagnum species tell you a lot, right? Just grouping them. But we still found some interesting results with our physiognomic groups, but and we can circle back to that later. So land use was accounted for using 3 different measures. The presence of stormwater facilities we used with various GIS layers from county and municipal agencies, as well as field inspection, locating them on the ground because some of them were quite old. Also, as I mentioned earlier, we calculated the amount of impervious surface area as another land use intensity measure. And then we had a land use index that we have developed using a previous tool. And this is essentially, we've assigned weights, impact weights, if you will, to different land use types. And we would then just calculate the proportion of a given land use within the watershed and then assign those weights and come up with an index of land use intensity as well. So now I'm just gonna, hopefully this will work. I'm gonna show you just a few examples of our study sites to just so you can see what the land use gradient looks like. We'll start with a reference site. This is called Cranberry Marsh 2. The purple line here is the extent, oops, there's a lag there, the extent of the bog. The yellow is the watershed. These are LiDAR predicted flow paths, and then those orange triangles are the locations of our wells. Moving over to Kings Lake Bog, which is another one of our reference sites. This one has a slightly larger watershed. Again, you know, relatively hardly any impervious surface area. There were some logging roads. In this particular, we had three of our well nests at this location. Moving on to another site. This site is called Trossachs Bog, and we have a bit more impervious surface area in a portion of the watershed. Again, 3 different well nests. You can actually see the distinction of the peatland center and the lag in this photo here. And then our next site, the video, I'm ahead of the video here, is Queens Bog. And it has, you can see much more impervious surface area within its watershed, including a ball field and others. And then we had 3 well nests as well. And then this site also had a pipeline go through it probably, I don't know, it's 40, 50, 60 years ago. So there was a physical impact to the site that was present as well. And then the last site, just going to show you, this is the site that had the most impervious surface area within the 50-meter buffer of the bog. You can also see the amount of impervious surface area in its watershed. Not sure how much of this water actually reaches this site anymore. And then we had 2 of the well nests sample locations at this particular site. So again, just wanted to give you kind of a visual of what these sites look like. They're relatively small bogs, peatlands, you know, and even those reference sites are essentially in industrial timber landscapes. So they're not free entirely of human activity. Unfortunately, in this ecoregion, we don't have that anymore. So hydrological data were analyzed at annual, seasonal, and monthly timescales. Water chemistry data were analyzed at the seasonal timescale, so looking at spring and summer, which is our wet and dry representation there. we used linear mixed effects models to determine the effects of watershed, climate, and land use variables on the abiotic and biotic measures. We used the Akaike information criterion to compare and rank those models. For vegetation, we used a permanova to test the hypothesis of different, compositional differences across those factors. And then we used non-metric multidimensional scaling to illustrate those relationships. So looking at our first question, do ombrotrophic bogs exist in Western Washington? Looking at topography first. So this graph shows the height of each peatland center above its lag. And so these values above each bar is the centimeters that the peatland center is above the lag based on LIDAR. For context, I included that raised bog I mentioned earlier, and you can see that raised bog is nearly 3 meters higher at the peatland center than the lowest point in the lag. So very significant. In contrast, our study sites were obviously not significantly raised. And in fact, only 18% of them were raised more than 50 centimeters above the lag. The majority of them, I think it was like 47% were less than 20 centimeters. So, because one indication of ombrotrophic conditions, of course, would be that it's raised, with the assumption that the water table is moving downwards towards the outer part of the bog. So if we weren't able, even though some of these sites appear to be slightly raised, we weren't really able to kind of draw that conclusion necessarily without looking at these other variables. In terms of vegetation, real quickly, this is a non-metric multidimensional scaling ordination, and you can see that the peatland center plots that are circled here are very distinct from our lag plots, which is what we predicted. The vegetation is clearly different in those zones. That is suggestive, obviously, that there is at least a different hydrological regime and water chemistry going on. It doesn't necessarily tell us why, but the biplot does show that, I should say, there's a little bit of indication of potentially why. There's a correlation with pH, January water levels, summer electric conductivity, and then calcium and magnesium. And many of those are indicators of ombrotrophic conditions, and we'll focus on a few of those next. The vegetation in the peatland center was, again, dominated by that bog vegetation I talked about. We had scattered trees with shore pine, Pinus contorta variety contorta, western hemlock, Tsuga heterophylla. Those were very scattered, the most common trees. There were other trees, but those two were very common. Two shrubs that are dominant, rhododendron groenlandicum, previously known as ledum, is in every bog I've ever stepped into in Western Washington. And it is the predominant shrub that you see in these sites. Kalmium microphylla, bark laurel, and then of course oligotrophic sphagnum species. So we have Sphagnum capillifolium, we have Sphagnum fuscum, and Sphagnum rubellum. The lags, in contrast, included more kind of what we call our deciduous shrubs and carex. So very common was Pacific crabapple, Malus fusca. You can see that it's located right here. This is all ledum or rhododendron here. This is the peatland center. Very stark, abrupt contrast there. Spirea douglasii is another common shrub. Various sedges, Carex aquatus, variety dives, Utriculata, Carex obnupta. And then sometimes we even get sphagnum in the lags too. But they're either minotrophic species or species that are more tolerant of minotrophic conditions like Sphagnum palestra, Sphagnum henriense, and Sphagnum pacificum, which is this one here. And then there are a lot of other species in the lags that pretty much any plant that we might find in any of our other wetland types, shrub swamps, forested swamps, marshes, could be in the lag. All right, looking at water table levels. So I'm not sure why I have an extra graph here. Oh, that's looking at, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to include this one here. So on the top is mean monthly precipitation over the entire length of the recording period. I think it goes back 80 years. This one over here was the mean monthly, and again, I apologize, it wasn't supposed to be, I think I was supposed to swap these. This is the mean monthly precip for the duration of our study period, 2018 through 2021. And this graph here shows the variability in water tables. And the black bars here are reference site peatland centers. The grays are developed site peatland centers. The blue, reference site lags. And the purple, developed site lags. So kind of a main observation related to the question of ombrotrophy. We're going to return to this graph to talk about land use. But related to the ombrotrophic question, you can see that there is a strongly seasonal pattern with water tables. Both zones decrease in our dry summer months. So again, that suggested that these sites are at least predominantly tied to precipitation. There's no kind of perennial groundwater discharge that's keeping water tables at the surface during the summer dry season. Our linear mixed effects models did show that water levels had a positive correlation with watershed size. So there might be some latent water moving through the watershed in some of these sites. So in other words, we can't assume necessarily that it's all entirely direct precipitation driven. So this graph summarizes the piezometer data and looking at vertical hydrological gradients at two depth ranges. One is the 50 to 100 centimeter depth, and the other is the entire profile that we looked at. Our deepest piezometer was at 200 centimeters. And so the way to interpret these graphs is increasing distance from zero, positive values indicate upwelling water or groundwater discharge. Increasing negative values indicate recharge, or that would be indicative of ombrotrophic conditions. And you can see that, things were pretty stable across the entire profile. We attributed this to primarily the lower zone being consistently saturated, and there wasn't really a lot of hydrostatic pressure going on there. So water was pretty stable there. But in that upper profile, we did see overall across plots that there was a slight average down gradient for most sites, suggesting, again, downward movement, ombrotrophic conditions. But there was a lot of seasonal variation and site variation. So again, these data suggest, again, potentially higher ombrotrophic conditions, but so far we don't have anything that's just screaming very strongly that we have ombrotrophic sites. But we are getting kind of a cumulative indicator potentially. Looking at variation in pH and EC, electric conductivity, average peatland center pH was well below those in lags. Again, the gray and the black are the peatland centers, and the blue and the purple are the lags. And again, that's a pattern we might, as noted earlier, that we might expect in a ombrotrophic system. And all the peatland center pHs were well below those for local precipitation, and even further below those reported for groundwater. Again, suggestive that groundwater is not getting into these sites and affecting the pH. The majority of sites also had pH values below an ombrotrophic pH threshold that was used by Malmer et al. For coastal bogs in British Columbia. And 64% of the sites were below the threshold 4.2 of pH, which was an ombrotrophic threshold that's been used in Europe for identifying bogs. Electric conductivity for the majority of the sites exceeded local precip, but they were well below groundwater. And then the exception, though, is for developed lags, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So this graph shows variation of major ions. The most significant one for related to the question of ombrotrophic conditions is calcium that I have highlighted here. That's because calcium is naturally very low in these bogs. And as such, it's a commonly used indicator to determine whether or not you have an ombrotrophic site. 76% of our sites had concentrations less than 2 milligrams per liter, which is a common threshold used in the literature. And again, you may notice those purple bars in the lags being pretty high. We'll get back to that in the next research question. So very busy table, not going to walk through it, just wanted to demonstrate that because we didn't have super strong indicators across the board for all measures in all seasons, we took a preponderance of evidence approach in thinking about this question of ombrotrophy. And so, we primarily focused on vertical hydrological gradients, pH, electric conductivity, and calcium. In the end, our conclusions were that 88% of our sites met chemical criteria as reported in the literature for being an ombrotrophic bog, while only 35% met both chemical and hydrological criteria. The hydrology was not a slam dunk. The chemistry was much more so indicative of being true bogs. So, but the take home I think here is really from a management perspective, and then this is also talked about in the literature, there's rarely this stark line between ombrotrophic conditions and minotrophic conditions. And so from a manager's perspective, we want to take a more nuanced view. And our data really suggests that minimally, they're predominantly supported by precipitation. And so that's important to think about when we're thinking about where stressors are located and how they might impact a site. All right, so moving on to our next question is how land use impacts these peatlands. We looked at a lot of different measures, but I'm only going to focus on the ones on the left here: shallow water tables, pH, electric conductivity, chloride, and calcium. And that's because they demonstrated the most meaningful kind of response and indicator of how these systems are impacted. So let's return back to this slide looking at water tables. Land use appears to have a larger effect on the hydrological regime in lags. Again, the developed lags being the purple bars here. But we really didn't see much of an impact in with the developed peatland centers. They were more variable, but that could be because the lags are performing their natural buffering function, right? The water comes into the lags, it generally stays there. And so these impacts aren't making their way into the peatland centers. Nonetheless, there were some patterns in the peatland centers that were interesting. They weren't significant, but they like I said, the variability in the winter was much greater for developed sites. But in the summer, we had the inverse pattern. Again, because our bogs dry out so much in the reference sites, you can see that they're highly variable and they'll respond very quickly to preset patterns. And so and the fact that the reference sites did not suggest that, again, maybe there's some latent water that's kind of keeping water tables up, potentially due to the amount of impervious surface area. We don't really know, but there was definitely this pattern here. Again, not significant, but I think deserves more investigation. And in fact, we do see this in looking at this graph here. On the x-axis is increasing impervious surface area. On the y-axis on the left, that's daily mean water levels in centimeters. The y-axis on the right is increasing buffer distance, so 50, 250 meters, 500 meters from the bog. And then we have our sampling periods. Black lines of the peatland centers, purple, blue lines, I guess, are the lags. And so lag water levels increased with increasing impervious surface area, even up to a distance of 500 meters. Our linear mixed effects model suggested that there's a complex kind of interactive relationship between watershed size, precipitation, and impervious surface area, which makes sense, right? In terms of larger catchment, more precip, more impervious surface area, you're going to kind of see a different effect or a more intensified effect. Looking at pH, developed lags was significantly higher than reference lags, again, during spring, but not summer. This suggests that during the rainy season, you're having higher pH water entering into the lags. I guess the good news is that we weren't seeing that effect in the peatland centers. And so again, could be indicative of the lag providing that natural buffering function, which is good news there. But clearly there are kind of pollutants, if you will, higher pH coming into the sites, the developed sites. There was an interaction between impervious surface area, stormwater inflows, and land use index. Looking at this x-axis, on the right is in more natural land cover, and on the left is more intensive land use. And you can see the strong effect that stormwater inflows had as well. And we had some interesting sites down here that we haven't quite figured out what's going on there. But lag pH was also, I think I just stated this, but strongly related to stormwater inflow. Again, it sometimes overrode some of these other variables. Electric conductivity was significantly higher in both developed lags over here, as well as developed peatland centers in both seasons. So the graph on the left, again, this is the same one we saw earlier with impervious surface area here, buffer distance, and in this case, corrected conductivity. And you can see that as impervious surface increases, the electric conductivity in the lags also increases. And the presence of stormwater inflow provided a very strong explanation, again, of electric conductivity. As a reminder for everyone, electric conductivity is a surrogate measure of all ions. And so higher conductivity typically is going to favor non-bog vegetation. So Uh, Over the long term, higher electric conductivity could result in a shift away from bog vegetation towards non-bog species. Chloride concentrations were also significantly higher in developed lags, as you can see in these purple bars. Um, and, and again, looking to the right, it also increased with impervious surface area, even up to 500 meters away from the peatland. Chloride can have negative effects to vegetation. Some researchers have found that chloride from road runoff can decrease sphagnum cover. And in fact, we did see not a strong correlation, but there was definitely a correlation between sphagnum cover and increasing chloride. We weren't able to demonstrate a cause and effect relationship there, but there was a pattern. Also, chloride could also potentially impact invertebrate diversity in these peatlands. And as I mentioned earlier, there's quite a few endemic and rare invertebrates that depend on these sites. So this is a concerning finding as well. Circling back to calcium, again, calcium was significantly higher in developed lags in the spring. Looking at the graph on the right, same pattern, increasing the surface area, increased calcium during the spring. There was also an effect from stormwater inflows. There was not a significant difference between reference and developed peatland centers, but you can see the amount of variability, and definitely we had higher values in some of our developed sites. And our linear mixed effects models did kind of relate to peatland center calcium concentrations to impervious surface area within the 50-meter buffer. So in this case, lags again seem to be providing a buffer from calcium moving entirely into the peatland. But these values here have us wondering if there's a limit. Essentially, do the lags get saturated to a point where that these ions can move into the site? And again, this is important because concentrations of calcium are naturally very low in these peatlands. And so any uptick, very low, like 2 milligrams per liter, any uptick in this could cause an ecosystem shift. So looking at vegetation across all of our plots in both zones, we had 116 unique plant taxa. Again, across plots, species richness in lags was much higher than peatland centers, but this wasn't always the case at the plot level, but just across all plots in each zone, it was higher. And as this graph on the right shows, there was a correlation between richness and increasing impervious surface area, although that relationship was almost entirely driven by changes in the lag. We didn't really see a strong relationship with the peatland centers. But if we look deeper into the compositional change, you can see these red bars I have highlighted here. We'll start with peatland centers. In the developed peatland centers, you can see that there was a decrease of sphagnum as well as lichen cover. That's concerning. Sphagnum are the keystone species really in these ecosystems. They are the peat contributor to the sites. Concurrently, there was an increase in feather mosses as well as deciduous shrubs, which is again kind of mirrors the concern of the loss of sphagnum. Looking at lags, there was also a more significant drop in graminoid cover in developed sites as well as feather mosses. And just a slight increase in tree cover as well. So there definitely is some compositional differences between these reference and peatland centers that we suspect is being driven by these land use variables. Primary take-home points are that the hydrological impacts were detected in the lags, but only slight hydrological effects, if any, were observed in peatland centers. Again, suggesting that the lags are providing their hydrological buffering function. However, we were seeing some chemical impacts in the peatland centers, slight but nonetheless detectable. And so that's concerning. And again, it just raises the question: is there kind of a temporal limit in the ability of the lag to be that buffer? And then, as I just mentioned, there's vegetation changes appear to be occurring as well. So our linear mixed effects models show complex explanations for the differences we observed in these two sites, reference versus developed. In some cases, the ecological factors such as watershed size and precip were shown to explain as much of the variation as the land use variables. But typically, though, there was an interaction between many of these variables. So, for example, the effects of impervious surface were amplified by larger watershed size, which is kind of an intuitive conclusion there. All that said, there were some things that were clear to us. Impervious surface area had significant effects on many parameters. And also stormwater inflows, very discrete stormwater discharge points were very conspicuous sources of impact, and they're detrimental to the peatland's integrity, even if they're treated before reaching the bog. We had one that was actually discharged on a slope. It did its job in that we didn't see a chemical signal from that, but we did see a hydrological change because there's just more water that we're introducing into the site. So the types and proportions, as we talked about earlier, of water sources can have a significant effect on these peatlands ecology. And again, as I concluded in our first research question, minimally, we suspect the majority of our bogs are at least predominantly precip fed, if not entirely, for some of our sites. And as such, we really feel these peatlands should be managed with the goal of preventing any anthropogenically derived surface or groundwater for entering the peatland basin. So we offer a few recommendations and emphasize some past recommendations to better protect these sites. Some of them pretty obvious, but nonetheless, I think need repeating. Restrict impervious surface areas within the watershed, peatlands watershed. Divert stormwater or road runoff downstream of the peatland or into an entirely different basin. Restrict any land disturbing activities from occurring in the peatlands watershed, such as logging, especially during the rainy season. Maintaining natural land cover, kind of the corollary of all that is critical. Use of calcium materials, construction road materials should be avoided within the peatlands watershed, and then avoiding fertilization of forests, lawns, of course, etc., within the watershed as well. In Washington, buffers are required around many permitted and proposed activities in Washington's wetlands, including bogs. Recommended buffer widths kind of vary depending on the wetland type. And usually they're just kind of a standard, distance out from the wetland edge. But our study showed that buffers, at least as they're applied today, didn't always protect these peatlands from these effects of land use. And so related to that, we ideally would treat the bogs watershed as the buffer. And I know that's asking a lot because some of these watersheds are large. So in those situations where we can't do that, we suggest extending the buffer from the outer edge of the lag, because again, the lag is a functional component to the bog, not from where the bog vegetation stops. And focusing the buffers within the bog's watershed. And that's just kind of, intuitive. I mean, there are other reasons to go outside the watershed for connectivity for animal species, et cetera, but from a hydrological perspective, it doesn't make sense to extend a buffer out where you're not really doing much to protect the inputs into the site. Extend the buffers out as far as possible, although as we showed, even out to 500 meters, we were seeing impacts. And again, they're only effective if they're within the watershed. And so, it might be more effective to focus the buffers around those conspicuous surface inflows into the peatland. And that would help potentially mitigate for some of these impacts. So the project definitely advanced our understanding of these sites and their response to land use activities, but like is often the case in research, maybe the biggest thing we learned is how much we don't know about these ecosystems. On the surface, they seem pretty simple. There's not a lot of species diversity. The hydrology seems pretty simple, et cetera. But there's a lot of things we don't understand. And one is the ecological role fire plays in these ecosystems. We know that fire has occurred in many of these sites. We don't know how frequent they were, their origin. We do know some of that. We don't know how intense they were, et cetera. So we don't know how fire or the lack of fire has shaped current ecological conditions. Also, the amount of woody vegetation in our bogs can be really high, shrubs and or trees. And so there's kind of been a common acceptance that that's just natural succession, and that totally could be the explanation. However, stressors, all the stressors that I talked about today, fire, climate change, could also be equal explanatory variables for the increase in woody vegetation. So we need a better understanding of successional dynamics in relation to these variables. And then this is related to the fire aspect, but we also need a better understanding how Native peoples manage these sites. We know that on the Western Olympic Peninsula, which is outside our study zone here, they were using fire to manage these sites for traditional use of many of the plants and for encouraging wildlife to occur in these sites. We suspect the same was done in the Puget lowlands. So those practices are really not occurring to the extent they were. So how has that affected the ecology of these ecosystems? And then, of course, climate change, on top of all this, is critical for understanding the long-term variability of these sites. So we really need to know, we need to piece all this together to better attribute changes to these various potential drivers. So we're currently working on a few publications, but in the meantime, you can look at our technical report that we submitted to EPA, and this is on our website. You can get to this QR code. And with that, Louis, I guess I will turn it back over to you.
All right, Joe. I think I'll be replaying this one for a while. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful presentation. I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to cut the question and answer short because we're running out of time. But please take note of Joe's email. If you have any questions that are preying on your mind, please contact him. Well, there are a lot of questions. Many of them I think Joe actually answered during the presentation, but please do not hesitate to contact him. And look for the presentation on YouTube in a few months. As we said in the chat, you'll see the presentation slides available then as well. I guess, Brenda, could you please forward the slides? I would just like to make a couple of announcements. We are going to have our next Spanish-speaking webinar that will be translated as Constructed Wetlands as an Option for Sustainable Treatment of Acid Mine Drainage, March 18th, followed on March 21st, an English-speaking webinar, Evaluating Wetland Stream Compensatory Mitigation. Please do not forget to register for these events, and please remember to take the survey at the end of this webinar. You'll be prompted and to send feedback, and also so you can receive a certificate of participation. And want to thank everyone so much for being here today. Thank our sponsors as well. Our first two sponsors of the year, Cattails Environmental and Davy Mitigation. And everyone, I hope you have a wonderful day. Joe, thanks again for this wonderful presentation. And we'll look forward to our next webinar.
Yeah, and my apologies to everyone for going over and not leaving time for questions. So, yeah, my bad on that. And Brenda mentioned the possibility. I'm happy to stay longer if that's a possibility, but otherwise I can try to address these via email.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll tell you what. We'll do this till we run out of time. Like I said, there are a lot of questions that you really answered as we went along. But there's a couple here that were kind of related. I liked this. There were is there a percent of impervious surface within the catchment area where there wasn't a significant difference between the site and the reference, or did you consider the size of the lag zone when looking at effects of surrounding land use? Are you working on any of that in
relation to the first question? That's an interesting. Yeah, we did not look at that. I don't know if we would have enough replicates to say something confidently about that in terms of the lag, in terms of the different amounts of impervious surface area. We were just kind of looking across that gradient. But in terms of the lag width, that's another really excellent point. I will say most of the lags in these sites were very narrow, 5 to 10 meters, wide typically. So there wasn't a whole lot of variation. Now there are, at least in our study sites, there are some sites where that is different and bigger. And so that would be an interesting aspect to a future iteration of this work.
have one from a fellow researcher. Have to paint the picture here. Joe, I'm currently a UWB student doing a water quality project at Carey's Bog in Redmond. The bog was extensively monitored in the 2000s during construction of a retirement home adjacent. The bog was pH 5.5 to 6.1 at the end of the monitoring, and the authors theorized it might become more bog-like in the future. However, in the last couple of years, the bog has been trending circumneutral, and the vegetation has been changing, and the site managers don't know why. Any ideas or why the bog might be losing its acidity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of much of what I talked about in this presentation is likely the reason, right? I suspect over there in Redmond, there's a lot of development as well. I don't know exactly where Kari's Bog is located, but I suspect you're probably seeing a lot of things I talked about, increased flows and surface water impacts. I'm not sure what the stormwater situation looks like there. Likely that's the case. In terms of it would become more bog-like in the future, I'd be curious to know what kind of where that, what the logic was there, if it was just, over time, peatland development. But if that's the case, we're talking a long time frame before that transition occurs. So it sounds like it's a water source issue is would be my guess. Or potentially the site never really was truly ombrotrophic, or and maybe historically wasn't ever really at that level. But if you have that historical information, maybe that would be necessary to think about.
Great, great. Here's one. I'm kind of I don't know if I understand this question, or I guess the jargon. Do you have patterned fens down in Washington? Patterned
We
fens.
we have one well-developed pattern fen in the extreme northeast corner of the state. We have some other sites in that part in the Selkirk Mountains, some other sites that start to develop these patterns. I mentioned my colleague Joshua Cohen, who I worked with. I was visiting him this past summer in Michigan, and our pattern fens look very different than what was in Michigan, which I think are more representative of what we find in the literature. But we do have one. It's a site called Bunchgrass Meadows, which is a research natural area on Forest Service land. It's cool. It's one of my favorite sites in the state, but that's about it.
All right. This is a part opinion question, and but do you think existing wetland protection regulations adequately protect bogs or other peatlands in Washington? If not, why?
So I guess based on what we were seeing in this work, I think we could maybe do a little bit better in thinking about how the buffers are applied, or stormwater. My colleague Jeremy Shaw, who was with Colorado State University, when he came out here, he was talking about how impressed he was with stormwater management in King County. I mean, some of the most progressive and best in the country was how he described it. Despite that, right, we were still seeing some impacts in these ecosystems, given how sensitive they are to the change in hydrology and chemistry. So I guess it's kind of like, I think we're doing a pretty good job relative to most areas, but maybe not enough in some situations for these specific ecosystems, especially in those areas where we're seeing a lot of development, which is where, again, where these particular peatlands occur. But overall, we have a really progressive and pretty awesome approach to at the state as well as low, county and city level as well. So there's a lot of interest in trying to protect these sites.
Yeah. In Florida, we have, we do have standard buffers that protect from secondary impacts, and the stormwater management is I can't speak to the water quality treatment that, I mean, it is supposed to be designed for water quality treatment, but there are these nuances that are affecting the peat bogs seem like they could probably be better defined in some circumstances, like obviously. But let me see. I think I saw another. Do you analyze water samples from the runoff and developments that nourish the peatlands? Did you see an effect here considering the change in species in some of the peatlands, higher abundance of feather mosses and deciduous trees, etc.? Like some of these you kind of already, already kind of covered, but would want to honor the question.
See if I can find that comment. I lost the train of thought there.
Well,
So
first of all, have you done any water quality sampling in the runoff from to some of these systems that you're studying?
So what we tried to do in some of our sites, which is why some of them had two lag wells, is where there was a conspicuous discharge point, we put one of our well nests in near that area to try to detect what kind of impact those particular locations would have. And they're definitely, like I said, in often cases that was the overriding driver of the correlations we saw. Even more so sometimes on the impervious surface. So, in our opinion, like I said, that is the single most important thing we might want to think about. And some of them, like one site, this Queens Bog site, had a discharge point that was probably 40 plus years old, like from a very old development that we actually had to, we suspected it was there based on some vegetation indicators, and we had to look hard to find it. We found it. So yeah, that's a big consideration. And I thought there was the other part of the question was there was something about feather mosses.
Yes. Did you see an effect here considering the change in species in some of the peatlands? For example, higher abundance of feather mosses and deciduous trees?
Yeah, so the big thing, so the feather mosses, the big one we were looking at is Pleurozium shrubberii, which is actually found in bogs across North America and I think Europe as well. It's a bog species, a conifer forest species. And so its presence isn't necessarily telling us anything, but it's the relative proportion of that species versus sphagnum seems to be, it was something that we were looking at and watching because there was that shift, right, towards the Pleurozium in lieu of the sphagnum. And that's concerning because, again, the peak contributor in these sites is the sphagnum. And so we were seeing that correlation in the developed sites of having more feather moss. Not that the sphagnum wasn't present, but there was a decrease in sphagnum and an increase in feather moss. And so that's concerning. That's also one we're watching and we're thinking about with climate change and shading. The Pleurozium does better in shade than the sphagnum. And as the trees encroach and increase more shade, and we have sites where we can actually see this, the sphagnum is just disappears, and instead we get feather mosses, lots of different Heliconium, splendens, and others that are very common in our upland forests. So that shift is really concerning to us, and whether the trees are driven by climate change or these stressors, that's something we're concerned about is that shade factor, because it'll shift the peat moss, it'll shift the moss composition.
All right. All right. Thinking that, this is interesting. This is almost the same, or along the same lines of what you're saying is the question is there any indication that summer drying / increased temperatures due to climate change in Western Washington peatlands trigger conversion to shrub / feather mosses over time? And what management approaches are you seeing emerge from these trends?
So on the latter, nothing yet. We get that question a lot. What should we do, right? And I think the hesitation on telling people to go cut trees down or thin out your shrubs is kind of what I ended my presentation noting. Like we can't confidently attribute yet this increase in woody vegetation to these factors. Like, is it the stressors? Is it climate change? Is it natural succession? Likely, it's a little bit of all that. And so, but we are seeing again, we looking at aerial photography. We've not quantified this yet, but it's something I want to do is to look at how much tree encroachment we've seen, and just anecdotally looking at sites. Many of our sites have much more tree abundance on them than they did, in the 1950s, and that's obviously globally that's been documented as well. So presumably there's a climate change driver there. One of the things we think might happen with climate change, or we intuitively would suspect would happen, is it was the increase of woody vegetation. And so there was a research done actually in the 60s and 70s that demonstrated that warmer winters resulted in increased germination of conifers in these bogs. So for us here in Washington, we're predicted to have warmer winters. I think what I've seen thus far is over the entire year, our precip isn't necessarily going to change, but potentially the timing of it. And so our summer dry season, if that widens, we get more tree seedlings, we get a wider dry season in the summer, presumably that's going to give a competitive advantage to trees. And then we could see more shading occur in these sites, which subsequently, again, we would see these changes in mosses. And so that's kind of a concern we have. So then it says, okay, if that's what's happening, can we manage the sites by periodically going in and thinning the trees, right? Like those are potential options to consider. Another wrench to throw in all this is for those of you that are from the Northwest, you may remember the heat dome from a few years ago, where we had, I think Seattle was like 109 degrees, Portland was like 114. I mean, off the chart temperatures for our area. We just don't see those. And what we saw on some of our bogs or all these tree seedlings were fried, just killed. They just, couldn't withstand the heat. So then it begs the question, well, how often are we going to have the heat domes and how does that play into the dynamics of increased tree growth? And it's just, again, we like to create this simple story of what we think is going to happen with climate change. And then we see something like that. And it's like, boy, we really, again, it goes back to how little we understand what's going on. But piece by piece, hopefully we'll get there.
All right. I'm going to have to sign off pretty soon, but and since there's a little bit of redundancy in some of these questions, and like I said, I think a lot of them were asked before you proceeded further into the presentation, but there is one. Is ombrotrophic / raised status associated with carbon storage? For example, are ombrotrophic bogs better at storing carbon?
That's a great question. I think it would really be related to, it comes down to like peat depth and I mean the volume of peat in a given site, maybe regardless of whether it's derived from ombrotrophic or minotrophic sites. Oftentimes what we've seen here anyway is the ombrotrophic sites typically will have more of those fibric peat layers. Humic, the fens are usually more of the humic and sapric as well. So maybe there's something there in terms of carbon loss on some of that decompositions that's occurred in the humic layers. That's outside my wheelhouse of expertise to really know what those carbon dynamics look like. But I would guess that predominantly it's going to really be of what that carbon stock looks like in a given basin. I know one of our sites, they're relatively small sites, but one of our peat cores went down like 21 feet, I believe, was the deepest one. So some of our peat deposits are pretty deep, whereas most of our fens might be half that, at its deepest, and usually much shallower than that. So.
All right. Well, there are still 60 attendees on the webinar right now, and I have to apologize because I have to leave. But thank you so much, Joe, for staying over and answering these questions. Once again, you all, please contact Joe if you do still have questions. And thank you so much for attending today. And as you see, Joe's email address is available right here.
Thank you all.
All righty.